Hey, everybody, welcome. I'm Natalie, and this is Scientology Life After a Cult, where we talk about what? Scientology and culty stuff. I want to welcome everybody here. Thank you so much, everybody in the live chat, for being here, especially the moderators for helping out today. Hey to you members. Don't forget, we're doing a members only live stream, 4 p.m. Central today. Hopefully, you can catch it live. If not, catch it on the replay. As we go along in our interview today, could you please put any questions or comments with maybe question in all caps in front of it so I can keep an eye on as many of those as possible so we can get to those. My guest today is someone I've not had on the channel before, Jon Atack. And Jon is a leading expert on authoritarian cult groups as well as a best-selling author. He's worked with hundreds of former members and has lectured and written extensively in a career spanning 4 decades, almost as long as I've been alive. Not quite, though. Jon wrote Scientology, the Cult of Greed, as a simple introduction to the subject. So if you've never been in Scientology, but you're all in on bringing down this cult, that would be a good one for you. And the book that he's probably most well known for is Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky, because Jon Atack's also a former Scientologist. And that book is the only comprehensive history of the bizarre group known as Scientology. So I think I will just bring them in and we will get going. Aloha, everybody. Thank you so much for throwing that in the chat. You know, I appreciate it. I want to thank Nova Scotia Beach Girl for becoming a member of the channel. Thank you so much. Mahalo to you. I hope you can make our members only live later. All right, everybody. Aloha. Lisa Kelson's here. We can get started. Welcome, Jon Atack.
Thank you for having me.
I have been wanting to have a chat with you for quite some time since I've been on YouTube. Your book, Let's Sell Them a Piece of Blue Sky, is a book that had an impact in my family. It's one of the books that my brother-in-law read first and shared the information with my sister, who left Scientology long before the rest of the family did. And I have heard from multiple other former Scientologists that Let's Sell Them a Piece of Blue Sky was the book that really helped them walk away from Scientology, in large part because of how you just pull back the curtain on who L. Ron Hubbard really was. Can you share a little bit about, because one thing I don't know a ton about is just kind of like what led to you leaving Scientology and then writing that book. And just so everyone knows, then we're going to get into some, I want to say fun, but how fun can mind control be? Great info on Scientology mind control.
Yeah, it's cool. We'll make it as much fun as we can. Yeah, I was 9 years in Scientology, 19 when I got in here in England. I was a true believer. I was also truly lucky. I never joined staff. I was never in the SEAL organization. So the slavery was psychological, not physical. I did auditor training, you know, Dianetics Method 1. I'm a class 2 auditor. I've got a certificate somewhere. And so I learned how to pull people's withholds. And I also did right through to operating Thetan level 5. So
I did not know that. I did through operating Thetan level 4.
Ah, well, I win then.
You do. You might be a little more culty than me.
Yeah, well, I've had a little time to de-stimulate, as Ron Hubbard
That's
would say
true.
as well.
You have been out of Scientology then for over 40 years.
41 years.
41 years. And you were in for 9 years. I talk about on my channel sometime how I have a goal. One of my goals is to be out of Scientology longer than I was in. And I did the math, and I think that puts me at about 70 or 75 when I will finally hit that point of having been out of Scientology longer than I was in.
I hit it at age 38, which is 31 years ago, where I'd been out for longer than I was in. And it was interesting, you know, my mum followed me in because she wanted to see if it was dangerous. And she went along to this course room where people were going off with his head and talking to dolls and playing with modeling clay. And she went, oh, this is a thing for me. So she was in for 8 years as well. And what happened was that things started getting nasty in 1982. There was this attack on David Mayo, and all I knew about David Mayo was that Hubbard had named him as his successor. That was simple. And suddenly we got this story of a squirrel accusing Mayo of being the bird dog in the control room, which is a expression stuck in my head all these years. And I was sort of, there was always, let's be honest, the Navy suits and the marching up and down. There was always a kind of militaristic fascism involved in Scientology, and I was never keen on that. But I thought it was going to save humanity. I thought this was a technology that would save us all. And, interesting. And it just happened that I started asking questions, and having had a very clean ethics record in Scientology, I think there were 2 negative knowledge reports in 9 years and a bunch of commendations to the various things I've done along the way. I got this thing, because I'd put out a list of questions. I'd said, is it all right to do this? Look at this policy. Is it all right to do this? And I was basically naming the things which the Commodore's messenger organization was doing. And of course, none of us knew at that time that Hubbard was still directing Scientology. There's no doubt.
Now, when you say no one knew he was still directing Scientology, so Scientologists were being told that Scientology was being run by somebody else.
No, Scientologists were being told that Hubbard was running it, but as David Miscavage took the blame very early on, after the Mission Holders Conference in October 1982, where we suddenly saw pictures of him, pointing at somebody and shouting at them and talking about being tough and ruthless. Now, at that point, he was absolutely following orders from Hubbard. I have no doubt about that now. So he was meant to, I think it was John Axel and Roger Barnes. He had to spit on one of them and hit the other. And this was a written order from Hubbard, I later learned. And he did it. He spat on one of them. And I'm told that spitting has become a common way of humiliating SEAL members.
So on the orders of L. Ron Hubbard, they were told to go spit on a staff member and hit the other one.
Yeah, that's right. And I had an email a few years ago from a guy who was desperate to find out certain information, and it turned out that he, on the day that happened, had been Miscavige had grabbed him by the throat and slammed him against some filing cabinets. And we subsequently found out that Miscavige is a deeply violent human being. He's a thug.
It's very interesting, though, because I've heard that there were reports of L. Ron Hubbard being violent or inciting violence. So it's interesting to have kind of a firsthand account of that actually happening back then.
Yeah. I mean, one of the reasons that I left was that I found out about severe reality adjustments, and I'd never heard of them. Then a guy that I'd hired, who'd been the commanding officer at St. Hill and a Hubbard aide, did it to my wife. I was running an artist's agency and she hadn't sold anything for a week. And he took her into this little room and screamed his head off at her. And when I asked him, why he was doing this, where is it written? If it isn't written, it isn't true. He said, it's not written anywhere. It's what Hubbard does to the people around him. And he was crying as he told me, as he realized this. And that was as I was sort of seeing things that I really didn't want to be involved with. I was told, in fact, it was the same man. I was told by an ethics officer that I had to disconnect from him, and I refused. That was in early '83, and I spent 6 months petitioning, the Continental Justice Chief, the International Justice Chief, the L. Ron Hubbard, because you could always write to Ron. He doesn't look at any of the letters, but you could always write to Ron. And I got no rational response. This guy was just put on a list of what eventually was 911 people who were suppressive. And there was no committee of evidence. There was no bill of particulars. All of the stuff this policy we were meant to be following, didn't happen at all. Hubbard was terrified that he was losing the organization, that the Guardian's office were going to go in cahoots with the mission holders. And so he set about destroying the Guardian's office, including his wife, Mary Sue, of course, and wrecking the missions, which he did very successfully in a short order of time. Scientology's income collapsed.
Can I just ask a question about that? So that was at a time when, so this was after the 11 Scientologists, including Mary Sue Hubbard, went to prison.
That's right.
For infiltrating over 136 different government entities. So so the fear was that the Guardian's office, but I thought that the Guardian's office had been disbanded by then.
The Guardian's office was, it was disbanded in 82 and renamed. And curiously, the people who'd worked in Branch 1, the part of the Guardian's office that harassed people, covert data collection, as it was known, they took Morrison Budlong off and he went to prison, but nobody below him was removed. The rest of the Guardian's office, legal, public relations, all of that. But Peter Stumkey, for example, and Miles Mellor, who were both Branch 1 agents, continued with their work, just relabeled as the Office of Special Affairs.
So all the dirty tricks and things that they were doing before didn't really go away, as Scientology wanted the world to believe. They just rebranded into the Office of Special Affairs.
Yeah, I mean, I was harassed on a daily basis for 16 years.
16 years.
Yeah.
Can you share some of, well, two things. I want to go back to the severe reality adjustment for just a minute, because we kind of glossed over that, but I want to make sure my audience understands, because I had forgotten this, Jon, till you just mentioned it now. Yeah. Giving an SRA, a severe reality adjustment, basically meant you just got a reaming, screamed at, with the intention of getting you to adopt the viewpoint that Scientology wanted you to have, or that person wanted you to have. I don't think I realized that. Was there later something written about that?
No.
So it wasn't something he actually wrote down. It was something that he did. Because growing up, I remember hearing about it, especially on staff and in the Sea Org.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
About how, like, that person needs an SRA, a severe reality adjustment. I didn't realize it was never actually written, that it was just going and screaming at people to get them to do what you wanted, which is how I observed it. That's interesting.
Yeah, and here's this interesting thought that if you want to control somebody, you give them conflicting information. Hubbard said this, and the whole basis of Scientology, this idea that you're going to get rid of these implants, these goals, problems, masses, is all, that you've had implanted into you oppositional terminals, so that on the one hand you're being told you're going to be, and on the other hand you're being told not to be, and that's what's kept you paralyzed and immobile. Scientology is constructed of implants, and that's the thing we will get to, because once you fathom that, once you get hold of that, it starts to make sense. So it's built on contradiction. So you have a guy who comes forward and he says, I have a modern science of mental health that will relieve trauma. Then in 1967, he forms the Sea Project, and he starts screaming his head off at people, throwing them overboard. The pictures of overboarding are in Auditor number 41, are actually credited to L. Ron Hubbard. He took pictures of people being thrown overboard.
Yeah, like he bragged about it. The thing that, Scientology wants to just put under the rug today. At one point, L. Ron Hubbard was out there. Here's some pictures of it.
Yeah. And on the page, it's got photo credit L. Ron Hubbard in an official Scientology publication. And so we start in 1950 with the idea we're going to relieve people of trauma. And then in 1967, he creates an organization where he will deliberately traumatize people. And the severe reality adjustment is a way of profoundly traumatizing people. And he even had a little method, which I was talking with Chris Shelton a couple of years ago, and he was saying, but Ron was compassionate, and I'm kind of not really. And he was, he was, and so, well, what you're going to tell me is that he walked up to somebody after he'd given them a severe reality adjustment an hour or so later, and he said, are you still mad at me? Chris went, yeah, that was what I was going to tell you. I said, it's a formula. He would scream at somebody, destroy them, and then come back to them and pretend that he cared. But the phrase would be, "Are you still mad at me?"
So L. Ron Hubbard would say this.
Yes.
So he would scream at somebody, belittle, like tear them down, and then ask if they're mad at him. So
yes,
that's part of the contradiction in the mind control.
Yeah. And when you read accounts, at the Clearwater hearings in May 1982, a lot of people testified about their time at La Quinta when they'd gone over the rainbow to work on Hubbard's personal staff. I was asked to go and didn't want to sign a billion-year contract, so that thankfully was an end to that. I've often wondered what would happen and whether I'd have gone along with it. I'm not one of those people who goes, "Oh, they've never got me." I seeing the conditions there, but there was a woman there who testified, and she said her husband, Adele Hartwell, and her husband was Ernie Hartwell. Her husband had been in the Navy, and she said, "I thought I'd heard swearing, and then I was around Hubbard, and he just effed and blinded all day long." And I interviewed various people who'd been there, John Nelson, Harvey Haber, who were there, and you got these terrible descriptions of this awful bully, this tyrant, and that, I'd only just come out and I still believed. So when I came out, I was all for, we're going to liberate Scientology from the Church of Scientology. We're going to make it affordable. We're going to get rid of this heavy ethics attitude. It's all going to be wonderful. And then I started finding out about Ron Hubbard for the first time and kind of went, actually, if he was that bad, then this stuff isn't good.
Yeah.
He had counter intention, as he would put it. His intention wasn't to liberate anybody; it was to enslave people.
Yeah,
So,
and what I like about your book too, and how you speak about it, that's so missing from how Scientology describes the narrative they give about L. Ron Hubbard, and so many people will leave Scientology and think just like you did. Oh, it's just because David Miscavage is a squirrel or so and so. But L. Ron Hubbard would never have done that. And then I'm like, oh, have you ever read this book over here? Because yeah, he did. I did not know too about like the level of swearing that he did, and it makes so much sense when you think about if L. Ron Hubbard was running around screaming at people to give them severe reality adjustments, then of course that would trickle down throughout management. Why would it be any different? But he is literally the source of Scientology, so it only makes sense that he's also the source of the abusive behavior.
Yeah, absolutely. The Germans say a fish stinks from the head down, and so when you're investigating an organization, you always look at the person at the top of it. And in the case of Hubbard, David Miscavige is a Hubbard clone. And there was a guy called Flaville Yeakley, what a great name, who wrote a paper called The Discipling Dilemma decades ago. And he'd been asked by Kip McKean, who was the head of the Boston Church of Christ, to prove that his group was not a cult. And he was given full access to the members. Now, he was an expert on personality testing, and he tested, I think, 900 members of this group. And he found that they all had the same personality, which is impossible. So he then went off and tested some Scientologists, and he said they had a different personality profile to the Boston Church of Christ, but they all had the same personality. So he found that when he tested ordinary Christian communities, that you got all 16 of the personality types,
Whoa, but in the cult, it was one personality type.
Yeah. And he calls this cloning, quite rightly.
But in Christianity, there were all the potential personality types.
In the less culty versions, yeah. In the regular versions, I mean, in the hardcore groups in Christianity, many of them, again, would produce the same personality profile, because the idea is that you are recreating the person in the image either of the leader or the image that the leader wants you to be recreated in. And so you get mini Hubbards, and you get these serious contradictions. It's like you are in Scientology. What you are learning fundamentally is how to project intention, how to make other people do what you want, whether they like it or not. Now, I came to realize that that's a horrid thing. It's better to cooperate with people, to tell them what it is you want, and to work towards their benefit, not just yourself. And Scientology leads to this incredible selfishness. You know, the word narcissism is bandied around rather a lot these days, but it makes people truly narcissistic. They want the auditing buzz. They want to get some more of this stuff. They don't achieve any of the things that Hubbard promised. This is one of the things that's really amazing. You go back to Dianetics, and you'll never get a cold again once you're clear. He promises. Oh, thank you, Deanna. I do my best. I'm actually a sitting encyclopedia at the moment. But you don't achieve any OT powers. If there was such a thing, supernatural powers were possible with Scientology, then I wouldn't be alive, would I? Because if thousands of Scientologists were using their special powers, then how could I even speak? They would have made me dumb by now. It's a fairy tale. It's from beginning to end, a fairy tale. All of these promises which won't be kept.
How did you, when you were in Scientology and you left, and like you were saying, you were kind of gung-ho on, we're going to make Scientology affordable. We're going to get rid of all this squirrel stuff. How did you get to the point where you were like, oh, no, I'm out. This whole thing is a cult?
Well, I put out my little questions to my friends in September and got a 83 and got a KR, a knowledge report, an ethics chit. And then I hosted the first meeting of disaffected Scientologists on the 18th of October, 1983. You can see snippets of Captain Bill at the Crown Hotel. That was a video I had made. And what had happened was 3 days before that, this guy had bust into my bedroom while I was still asleep, saluted me, and asked if I'd host this meeting. And I'm kind of thinking, wow, he saluted me and called me sir, okay. And that's how I became the chairman of the OT Committee UK. I'd never met Captain Bill. I had no idea who he was. And I suddenly found that I was an independent agent with control over the United Kingdom. And I was the whole of the OT Committee, because of course my body thetans were all, on there as well. Sorry about that. And so I defended the independent movement from Scientology. And, so there were half a dozen sort of people who set up and were delivering services. Isn't that a wonderful language? Terminals delivering services. Yeah. And in the November, this wonderful guy called John Hanson, this New Zealander, he'd been over to the States and he'd met this lawyer, Michael Flynn, who was suing Scientology. He got, I think, 25 cases, including Jerry Armstrong's case. And Flynn had said, I don't have time to talk to you. Here's this stack of documents. So like about an 18-inch pile of documents. And John said to me, he said, I don't have time to read this. Here, you have it. And I read through the whole pile. And then I got some sleep. And these are documents collected by a guy called Michael Lynn Shannon, who was a journalist, who disappeared off the face of the earth. I tried for years to find him. I couldn't find anything about him. I think it may have been a made-up name even, but he had done incredible research.
So you came into, you ended up receiving all of his research and documents that he did. And was he a journalist? Yeah,
he was somebody something had upset him about Scientology. He realized it was harming people. And so he'd dug deep. He wasn't the first. There was a guy called James Phelan in 1963 who did a pretty good job of showing that what Hubbard said about being a nuclear physicist and a civil engineer and a mathematician, these were all bogus stories. There was a guy called Alexander Mitchell in 1969 working for the Sunday Times who found Hubbard's connection to Aleister Crowley, in the magical ceremonies, trying to manifest the Antichrist with Jack Parsons in 1946. I got very deeply into that and found documents that hadn't been seen, talked with Crowley's literary executor, John Simons. And there's a chapter in Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky called His Magical Career.
Wow. What was it like for you as a former Scientologist and being once a true believer to be exposed to so much information in one sitting that is basically showing you that L. Ron Hubbard is a complete fraud?
it was a severe reality adjustment.
Minus the yelling.
Yeah, my whole world changed. And when I talked with Aaron a couple of years ago, he said he'd not had any existential crisis, which is a very good way of putting it, when he left Scientology. And many people collapse. It's like I was saving the world yesterday. I was clearing the planet, and now I'm buying potatoes in the supermarket. What am I doing? And for me, I just felt this incredible liberation. I realized that I'd had all of these tram lines put in that I had to think along. And, I did the data series course as well. Data series evaluators course, said to be the supreme course on logic in the known universe. So I was well aware of how Scientology functioned. And I started to see cracks. I started to see that it didn't actually make sense. And for 9 years, and that I no longer had to comply with Ron Hubbard's thinking, that I could think for myself. And I realized this was a tremendous moment because, I was 28 years old. And realistically, it was probably the first time I'd really thought for myself. I'd been attracted to other ideas. I was in Zen Buddhism for a year before Scientology. I went to a monastery. I learned to meditate. But it was sort of, no, we've this whole guru idea, this whole thing of, submission to somebody who's smarter than we are, it's a bad idea. We have to learn to become our own gurus. And that sort of was a spontaneous process for me. I carried on reading tens, hundreds of books to try and understand things, whether psychology or mysticism or whatever. But it was me making the decision. There was no kind of, here's the cookie cutter. When the Times newspaper published the obituary of Hubbard in '86, they said that he was the Henry Ford of spirituality, that he'd created a production line, and everybody did the same thing, and you just went up this production line. I never found out who wrote that article. Whoever it was knew what they were talking about, and they also knew not to put their name on it.
Oh, the guy you mentioned who got all of those documents that you had, who did the research. So you never found out, he just up and disappeared one day.
He appeared to evaporate, and he'd been tremendously careful because he knew that Scientology would ruin him utterly, to use Aaron Hubbard. I'm going to say something that's not meant to be facetious, and it isn't facetious, and that is that Scientology has claimed that the writings of Aaron Hubbard are sacred scripture. So the phrase, if possible, ruin him utterly, is a scriptural instruction to Scientologists. So Hubbard, it was 1955. It's called The Scientologist, a Manual on the Dissemination of Materials. And that was the next part of my voyage, that I'd seen all these things, that he was lying about his background, his college records. I now went on to see what he'd said himself. And let's sell these people a piece of blue sky. More than half of the material in it is, he was my source. He was the source for the book. Yeah. That he said all of these evil, awful things, and then tried to pretend that he was helping mankind. And that just, so I went back through the tech volumes and the lectures, and I found all sorts of nastiness year in, year out. From the very beginning, he was hurting people. He was controlling people. He was taking all the money. One of the commonest phrases I heard when I interviewed people, and I interviewed a lot of people, was he spent money like water.
Wow. L. Ron Hubbard.
Yeah. There's a day when he just pulled a bankroll out of his pocket and bought a new Cadillac for a girlfriend.
For a girlfriend?
Yeah, and it was the bankroll had come from one of the Hubbard Dianetic Research Foundations, all 5 of which went bankrupt because he'd stolen the money.
Was this when, wasn't he married to Mary Sue then?
No, this is before Mary Sue. This would have been Barbara Cloden, who during his second marriage, and he had no second marriage, as he says on The Shrinking World of Aaron Hubbard, he only had a first marriage and a third marriage. Go figure. But while he was married to Sarah, Sarah Hollister, who had been Jack Parsons' girlfriend and sister-in-law. This very complicated relationship. So while he was married to her,
It's
and
more
she had
complicated than my family with the grandpa dad.
more complicated than most things.
Mhm.
But he had a wife and child, a young baby, Alexis Valerie, and he was already cheating on his wife. Barbara Cloden, when Russell Miller, who I worked with, wrote the brilliant book Barefaced Messiah, he interviewed Barbara, and she said one day Hubbard came and said, "You've got to leave. You've got to move out of the apartment now," because his wife was coming. And but yeah, he bought her a Cadillac, and she was one of a number of women who turned down proposals of marriage from him over the years.
Wow.
So then came Mary Sue, who was 18 years old when he met her. And
Did you, John, did you ever meet or speak to L. Ron Hubbard?
no, I did not. Yeah, I was lucky in that way. Yeah, the rabbit hole keeps on going, believe me. I've been down it for 50 years, really, from when I first got involved. And it just keeps going outward, finding out where Hubbard got his ideas from, what his real intention was, and how it works, which is this thing that I don't think enough has been said about the techniques. And L. Ron Hubbard Jr., who was his father's deputy from 1952 to 1959 and saw everything that was happening. He said Scientology works not as L. Ron Hubbard says it works, but as L. Ron Hubbard intends it to work. And among the sacred scriptures of Scientology, we have the Philadelphia Doctorate course. Listen to me for 6 weeks, give me $500, and you'll have a doctorate. You'll be a doctor of Scientology because you listened to me for 6 weeks. In those lectures, he says we have ways of making slaves here. He was telling the truth, not something he did very often, but he was telling the truth. Scientology is a way of making slaves. It creates dependency in people, and it creates fanaticism in many people, so that they become willing to harass other people, to belittle and humiliate other people, and they lose compassion, which is the fundamental of Scientology, that where religions generally, not all, Thuggees and the Aztecs, not all based on compassion, but most religions claim to be based on the love of humanity. Scientology is a way of eroding compassion in people and making them more selfish and more greedy.
So it's so interesting because, and this is what I'm looking forward to you sharing too, is this whole idea, which is the truth, that L. Ron Hubbard intended it to be this way. It didn't become this. He intended to make slaves. He intended for the mind control to work this way. And when you talk about it causing a lack of compassion and empathy, while also just fostering, just being so willing, like you said, to go at people and, scream and yell and be angry and try to force them to do things and to try to control other people. How, and you're probably just about to get into this, but so how did he do it?
Well, and let's talk, let's add something to the idea of overboarding that's not necessarily obvious. First of all, you're being thrown from 25 to 40 feet. The high diving board in the UK is 14 feet. You might not be able to swim. You'll be blindfolded. Your ankles will be tied together with a rope so you can be hauled back up. And most of the overboarding happened in Corfu Harbour. And in a harbour, all of the boats are letting their sewage out into the water. So L. Ron Hubbard was having blindfolded people thrown from a great height for perhaps being 2 minutes late for course.
Wow.
Into human sewage. And if that's what you want, then do Scientology.
Wow.
It's the road to total greedom. let's backtrack in, when does this start? When does he first show this determination to control people? There is an answer there. There's a letter in January 1949. Hubbard's literary agent from the 1930s right into the 70s was a man called Forry Ackerman. He was a lovely, brilliant man, and he shared the collection of letters he had from Aaron Hubbard with me. And Tony Ortega has put up this letter somewhere on his site. January 1949, he's in Savannah, Georgia. He's staying with his own guru, a man called Burks, who's a major in the Marines, so Paris Island. And he writes this letter to Forry Ackerman. He calls him 4E, dear 4E. And he says that he's worked out this method that is going to make more money than anything he's ever thought of.
And this is Ron Hubbard saying this.
Yeah, this is Ron Hubbard talking to his literary agent about the beginnings of what will be Dianetics. And he says that it's a method whereby you can rape women and they will know nothing about it. He doesn't say anything about it helping anybody. So
he's saying this to his literary agent.
Yeah. And at the bottom of the letter, he says, of course, this is confidential, Pard. Don't share this with anyone.
Wow.
So his cynicism is remarkable. On the 10th of April, 1953, he wrote a letter to the head of the Hubbard Association of Scientologists at the time, Helen O'Brien, with whom I was in touch. And he asks her, what do you think of the religion angle? This is the first time it comes up that he's saying, it will put us beyond prosecution by the medical authorities. And he'd already been sued for practicing medicine without a license by the New Jersey Medical Association. And by going bankrupt, had got away with that. But now he's saying, oh, well, if we're a religion. And he then talks about this being a way of making more money, which leads us years later to the governing policy of Scientology, a policy letter that says the governing policy of Scientology, the religion of Scientology, is make money, make more money, make others produce so as to make even more money. And we don't find anything about helping mankind. It's all contradiction. So, okay, there's the first point, contradiction. It's called double bind theory.
Double bind or blind?
Double bind.
Double bind. Okay.
So double blind studies where you have a placebo and the thing, and a double bind where you give somebody a contradiction so that they don't know what they ought to do. So they've been given conflicting information. Scientology is built on this. I wrote a paper called Never Believe a Hypnotist, which is a quotation from Hubbard's book, Science of Survival. Never believe a hypnotist. Aaron Hubbard boasted that he'd learned hypnotism at the age of 16. In that paper, I analysed work from 1950 to 1952, where Hubbard talks about hypnotism, and he talked a lot about it. In the book Dianetics, and I didn't notice this, I read it 3 times when I was in. I don't know how, but I did. Turgid nonsense. He says on one page, hypnotism wasn't used at all in the research of Dianetics. On another page, he says Dianetic research was done using hypnotism.
So that's intentional to have the contradictions, do you think? Or do you think he just slipped up and maybe they caught it in editing later? Like, do you think that's in the current Dianetics book? Because David Miscavage kept saying, we went through the books and we cleaned it up. Do you think, or do you know if that's something that they changed?
I don't believe they did. There was an independent group in Germany who went through the golden age of tech publications and pointed out all sorts of changes, but they were largely, the word father used as a noun or the word father used as a pronoun. It has a capital F as a noun. It has a lowercase f as a pronoun. So where mistakes like that had been made, they were corrected. The punctuation was corrected. There are some changes. And of course, there's a Scientology policy directive called Integrity of Source that says you can't change anything, Hubbard said. He's the only person. Well, Miscavage definitely did change some things. Scientology History of Man, in the early editions, when it was originally called What to Audit in 52 when it was released. But the editions going right up to Miscavage's time start, this is a cold-blooded and factual account of your last 60 trillion years. The current edition says 76 trillion.
What was the first number?
60.
60, and then it went to 76 trillion. Why do you think that was?
Oh, I know why it was. During the course of
that
giving,
book right here.
Have you got, show me the cover. Let's see which edition you've got. Yeah, that one says 76 trillion at the very first line of it. It's a cold-blooded and factual account of your last 76 trillion years.
Wow.
Which I wrote in 2 weeks.
Yeah, you're right. It says this is a cold-blooded and factual account of your last 76 trillion years.
Yeah, well, that is an alteration of the tech and squirreling. And the reason it's there is because in the original edition, which I say was written in 2 weeks, imagine that. It took me 6 years to write a history of Scientology. He did a history of the entire universe for 76 trillion years in just 2 weeks. Smart bloke. But the reason it says 76 is because Miscavige realized that during the text, Hubbard forgets the number he started with. And he says 73 trillion. And then towards the end of the book, and it's only 90 pages long, he says 76 trillion. So it's been corrected to make it consistent.
That's interesting.
Squirreling.
Yeah. So L. Ron Hubbard, a lot of the correction, because that's something I know when I was in Scientology, is when the whole golden age of tech thing was going on. And David Miscavige said that they've been going through L. Ron Hubbard's, all of his books and everything, and lectures, and correcting any grammatical errors. There was no mention of L. Ron Hubbard himself made the mistakes. It was the transcribers made the mistake.
Yeah. One of the perversities about Ron Hubbard is he is in the Guinness Book of World Records as the most prolific author of all time. But in fact, he only wrote one of the Scientology books. The rest were all compiled by editors.
From his lectures.
Or from conversations. Science of Survival was the second book. That was, Hubbard just spoke onto some kind of dictaphone, which had these little green discs on them. I have seen some of them along the way and heard the recordings from them. When he stole the baby, Alexis Valerie, from his first marriage and fled to Cuba and threatened to chop her up and throw her in the river if his second wife wouldn't grant him a no-fault divorce, he was dictating this book. But he was just, in fact, putting out random ideas. Richard DeMille, who was his assistant at the time, and here's a story, he's the adopted son of Cecil B. DeMille, one of the most famous film directors of all time, the man who made Ben-Hur.
Wow.
And he later became a psychology professor, and I was in touch with him along the way. He wrote 3 of Hubbard's books. And he said, they were Hubbard's ideas, but I put them together. And,
that just blows my mind, because I don't think I've even heard this, that L. Ron Hubbard didn't actually write the books, that other people put them together. He just wrote Dianetics. That's
the only one. All of the others, and sometimes you can see it. There's a dedication in old editions of Scientology 8.80 to a man called Althea Hart. And Hart left in 1954 and started a brilliant newsletter for ex-members in the 1950s called the Aberree. And all of the famous people who left Scientology, and everybody pretty much, oh God, I'm generalizing, I must be a suppressive person, almost everybody left. The big names right from the start. So when Hubbard announced Dianetics, he had the backing of Dr. Joe Winter. Winter left. In 1950, after selling 150,000 copies of Dianetics, the mental science of modern health, as I like to think of it, the publisher, who was Art Sepos, Hermitage House, withdrew the book because it was fraudulent. And he commissioned Dr. Joe Winter, who'd worked on the book with Hubbard, to write a book called A Doctor's Report on Dianetics, where Winter says, I think Dianetics is a good idea, but L. Ron Hubbard's a con man. You know, and he'd lived with Hubbard for 3 months while they were working on the book. And you
Wow.
find one person after another. Don Rogers, who wrote the appendix to that book, I interviewed him in the 80s, and he left in 54, not distressed with Hubbard particularly. He felt he'd cracked his case. 30 years later, he didn't feel that.
Yeah.
And rather tragically went back to Scientology during my
Mhm.
interviews, which is...
Whoa.
Again, Tony Ortega has put up the letters that Don Rogers wrote to me, and "Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky" comes from Don Rogers, because on the day in April 1950 that Hubbard opened the doors of the first foundation in Elizabeth, New Jersey, just before he opened the doors, he turned to Don Rogers and he said, "Let's sell these people a piece of blue sky."
Mm.
Something worthless, that is to say. Something,
Yeah.
you know. Yeah. So that's about his intention, you know, that before the beginning and forever was the cause. And the cause was L. Ron Hubbard, who was a shyster with a long reputation of conning people. He'd been arrested for check fraud. In fact, when he died, to make sure it was him, his fingerprints were checked against the arrest record for the check fraud, which had happened in San Luis Obispo, and because he died in Creston, just outside of, so they were able to confirm that it was in fact L. Ron Hubbard.
Wow.
So he comes along, he gets this idea, you know, it has all of these selling angles, and away we go. So let's look at what it actually is, and we might have to come back for a few hours along the way. He starts with a technique that is lifted whole cloth from Sigmund Freud. Dianetics is described in a lecture given at Worcester, Massachusetts, before the First World War. So it wasn't a reincarnation of somebody who'd come up with the technique. He'd been born in 1911, and around this time Freud gives this lecture, one of the few lectures in English and one of the first things published in English. And in this lecture, there are 5 lectures. Penguin Books still publish them. Freud says, here's this technique: you count backwards from 10. You get people to repeat phrases. You get rid of emotional charge. You wait for the eyelids to flicker. Hubbard cancelled Dianetics in 1951 when he said this is a method of hypnotism, and we're still back to it. The book one course.
L. Ron Hubbard canceled Dianetics and said turns out it's hypnotism.
Yes. Same. The paper I wrote called "Never Believe a Hypnotist," which is on my website. I explain, you know, gives the reference as to where this comes from. But in Science of Survival in the summer of 1951, Hubbard says you mustn't use this method anymore because it's hypnotism. If you look to the Hubbard Dianetics Auditor course that was released in 1977, it's right there in the 2 pages of instructions. You wait for the pre-clear's eyelids to flicker, a sign of hypnotism, as Hubbard says, of hypnotic trance. Here we come up against the first of the Scientology implants. And if we can't get past this one, we won't escape. The first of these implants is you induce phobia. Cults function by making you frightened of things and making you guilty about things and making you disgusted about things. So you have these reactions that stop you from thinking. So you're phobic, you're frightened. So if you say hypnotism to a Scientologist, they go, it's not hypnotism.
Yeah. That's what I was always told. That's what I always thought. Oh, it's not hypnotism.
So what exactly is hypnotism then? Well, according to the Oxford Handbook, which is Oxford University's description of hypnotism, hypnotism is guided imagination. That's a full definition. Guided imagination. So you give somebody the idea that they have, for example, engrams. They have these moments of unconsciousness that they've recorded, which are now dictating their behavior to them. You've guided their imagination to believe this. Is it true?
Yeah, like L. Ron Hubbard does with reactive mind. He says, you have a reactive mind that records these moments of pain and unconsciousness.
Exactly. So that reactive mind will now be constructed by Ron Hubbard. In real terms, I have gone down many rabbit holes over the last decades, and one of them was research into memory. And one of the facts that comes out of memory research is that if a boxer is knocked out during a contest, they won't be able to remember the 10 seconds, I think it is, leading up to the knockout, because memory is not laid down because you've been knocked unconscious. So you don't remember what happened just before.
Mm-hmm.
No, but there was only ever, the modern science, there's that word science. Now, science is based upon observation and experiment. It is empirical. You do experiments. There was no scientific inquiry. There are no papers of any kind. There were no studies done. He released his material. Then the Los Angeles Foundation tried in 1950-51 to prove that engrams are true. It's the only attempt that was ever made to show that Dianetics or Scientology is scientific. And what happened was, and they published the paper, and Hubbard even refers to it in Science of Survival. And what they found was that they couldn't recover anything. They knocked somebody out and they couldn't recover anything. There's never been a proof of engrams, and yet it's sold as a way of curing people.
So are you saying, I want to make sure I'm understanding this then, that if a person is knocked out, they get into a car accident, they fall off a ladder, whatever it is, and per Scientology, per L. Ron Hubbard and Dianetics, your reactive mind starts to record what you smell, what you feel, all of those things. And then in Dianetics, in the procedure, you go back and you contact that moment of pain and unconsciousness. But you're saying it's never been proven that you can actually go back and recall if you've been knocked unconscious. Like there is no recalling back of that memory. So people then just have like you said, so it's imagination, like this is what I think happened, but they believe that it's real.
Yeah. We in this country have a guy called Derren Brown, who's a mentalist. He reads people's minds. He does this kind of thing. And he has he's done a lot of TV, done a lot of shows. There are amazing points where he demonstrates how you bring about false memories. And the most incredible one I've seen is where he takes a woman, she's in her early 30s, and she grew up in an atheist household. She has never believed in God. And he has a conversation with her for 10 minutes. At the end of which she says she feels the presence of God. And he has not used the word God at any point. He has brought around to this. There's another case where he has a guy, and he's checked very thoroughly with the guy's family to be sure. And he implants a false memory about him having gone up in a hot air balloon. And the guy just won't believe that it's otherwise once the memory is put there. And this is one of the first things that I came to after I'd left Scientology. It's, oh my, we see memory and imagination on the same screen in our heads. And it's very easy to persuade people that, 76 trillion years ago, they were on a spaceship with Ron Hubbard. I already, before I left Scientology, was starting to worry. I may have noticed I have a slightly unusual memory. It's not my fault. I was born this way. I can't help it. So I remember details of certain information a little bit more than is usual. And by the time I left Scientology, I was really starting to wonder, because these people were remembering all of these incredible things when they'd been Jesus or Napoleon or whoever. But if I asked them what they'd done last week when we last met, they couldn't tell me.
Oh, I couldn't tell you what I had for breakfast.
Exactly.
Yeah,
I can tell you what I had for breakfast because I had the same thing every day. But
yeah.
And there is also a difference, by the way, between our data memory and our episodic or anecdotal memory, the memory of life. The guy who won the Nobel Prize for research into memory was a guy called Eric Kandel. And he did some very laborious work on memory cells. And he found out how memories are laid down in the brain. And that's going to take us to our next thing. We've gone to implant number one, which is Scientology isn't hypnotism, even though I don't know what hypnotism is. L. Ron Hubbard says, to be a good auditor, you've got to understand what hypnotism is.
Wow.
in one of his lectures. And I think that's probably true.
Mm-hmm.
So if we then say there's this other, the next phobia is the brain.
Mm-hmm.
So L. Ron Hubbard's construction of thinking is you are a thetan, you are a spirit, a being, and you carry around with you a big bag of mental image pictures. They are taken every 24th of a second, which curiously was the running time of frames in the movies at the time. We run much faster things now, but apparently it was the same as the movies. So you've got a thetan and a big bag of mental image pictures. Now, just imagine the mass of these mental image pictures, 76 trillion years. And you're taking one of these pictures, 24 of these pictures every second, and they contain every perceptic. So, you know, they're like the feelies in Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. They've got the aromas, they've got the feelings.
Mm-hmm.
How many of those, and, you know, somebody quickly work this out with a calculator. In 76 trillion years, how big is that bag? How many memories have you got in it? And how are they being kept in order? And is that what the mind is? Because that's all we're offered by Ron Hubbard. That's all we're offered.
Yeah.
And the brain is just a switchboard, right? Just like a telephone exchange, he says. Well, how is it then that if you knock out any one of the 200 regions of the human brain, you'll get a specific response? So, for example, if you damage Broca's area, you won't be able to find words. You'll get Broca's aphasia. Well, if you're a thetan with a big bag of, how is it that if you touch that spot in the brain, that you'll get this response? Well, we're Scientologists. We're phobic about the brain. We're phobic, you know, that's, the brain means people are going to cut pieces of it out and it's horrible. And no,
the psychs,
who, and, you know, any word that has psych at the beginning is psychologist, psychotherapist, psycho's the rapist, or psychiatrist. These people are a huge conspiracy to destroy all life, Hubbard said. Well, I've met psychiatrists along the way, and there were some of them I really didn't like, and I do object to the, you know, psychic surgery and the use of electroconvulsive therapy generally. I really do, and I've campaigned against it. So it's not because I've been bought by the psychs, but I would say that it's like with rabbis. If you get two rabbis in the room, you get three opinions. The idea that everybody in psychology, every form of psychotherapy, every form of psychiatry is part of some massive conspiracy that's running throughout the universe is balderdash. It's paranoid nonsense. And it started when L. Ron Hubbard had a psychiatric examination, and he was pro psychology, psychiatry until he had this examination in 1951. And it was pointed out for his wife, for the divorce case, that he certainly had some psychotic tendencies. He had sought the help of psychiatrists. In my little book, Scientology, Cult of Greed, I reprint a letter that he wrote in 1947, signed L. Ron Hubbard, demanding psychiatric treatment because he was in such a mess. He didn't use Dianetics to heal himself. He actually used hypnotism. And we, of course, have the hypnotic affirmations that he was using in the 1940s because Jerry Armstrong brought them out with him.
That's right. But I remember hearing about L. Ron Hubbard's affirmations, and some of them were kind of wild.
Yeah, men are my slaves. He would repeat to himself, men are my slaves, men are my slaves. I will go and help them. Elemental beings are my slaves. You know, you have perfect and lovely feet. That's my favorite of the affirmations. I don't know. He was very worried about his feet. He kept them hid. He said in, you know, when he first was talking about his war wounds, there's an interview in Look magazine in November, December 1950, and he's asked about his war wounds, and he doesn't have any war wounds. That was something he invented later. And he talks about having pink eye, conjunctivitis, falling down a ship's ladder, having his eyes hurt by the flash of a gun, and something wrong with my feet. So you see the feet they recur. The years go by. There was something wrong and funny about his feet. Maybe he had webbed feet, or maybe he had cloven hooves.
Yeah. So you've got the contradiction in Scientology, and then comes the phobia.
Yeah, you induce phobias. You make it impossible for people to see things. what's called cognitive dissonance. You know, that you start to dissociate and feel dizzy and weird. All the study phenomena, as he calls them. You start, I don't want to look at that. I don't want to think about that.
Mm-hmm.
So if anybody criticizes Ron Hubbard, if anybody criticizes Scientology, it used to be if anybody criticized Mary Sue Hubbard, but I think she's off the confessional list now.
Mm-hmm.
That you can't look at it, you daren't look at it. And then we come down to auditing itself and what is happening. Now, firstly, people are being asked to spontaneously generate false memories.
Mm-hmm.
And they will. I mean, when I got involved, I guess it's the same for anybody else. You go, oh, these people can remember their past lives.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, I wondered what technique they use. And the technique they use is there an earlier similar incident? That's the whole,
Yeah.
you're not taught anything.
And in Scientology, in Scientology auditing, an auditor, no one's going to tell you, no, that didn't happen. So you could say, oh my gosh, I'm recalling that I was in a spaceship 20 million years ago and flying through and this happened. Because you're right, every procedure in Scientology goes back to, is there an earlier similar time that XYZ, whatever it is? And imagination plays such a role in that. And in Scientology, we were convinced that it was accurate because of the e-meter.
Yes, let me tell you a story about the e-meter. I interviewed a guy called Derek Colley, who got into Scientology in 1954 in England.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a lovely guy. And I got very interested in the kind of different species of Scientologists, that the people who got in the 50s tended to be science fiction readers who were into electronics.
Mm-hmm.
And they didn't think Hubbard was a god. That they had sometimes very negative attitudes about him. Now, so Derek he wasn't fanatical, he wasn't fervent at all. And he said when he saw the OT3 material, he went, oh dear, what am I involved in? And then he said to me, but I thought I'll check it on the e-meter. And it seemed to be true. And I said, did you check the e-meter? And he went, oh, I didn't think about that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the e-meter, oh dear, oh no. Firstly, it's called the Hubbard electropsychometer,
Mm-hmm.
even though the man who designed it was called Volney Matheson.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, we claim credit for things. I knew this guy called Barry Pemberthy, who used to fix e-meters at St. Hill. It's him and another guy that they did it for years.
Mm-hmm.
And Barry was a good friend. He was a sweet man. And they were talking about it and they said, why are e-meters made with the cheapest possible components? They're made with rubbish. He was very upset about them using germanium transistors. I've got no idea why that's a bad thing, but apparently it's a terrible thing to do. But they're very cheap. And so they said, let's build an e-meter that uses the most expensive components. He said the meter we built, just the jewel on which the needle pivots, costs as much as all of the components of the then Mark V e-meter. So just the thing the needle pivots on. We used the best of everything. And then we set up a pen recorder. We put the same impulse through a Mark V and our meter, which they later would call the ability meter. And then we went to the pub to have a drink, because that's what you do. And when we got back, we found there were twice as many readings on the Mark V. And so we went, oh, where have we gone wrong? We went to the pub. So the next time they did it, they watched half of the readings on the Scientology e-meter were generated by the machine.
Whoa.
Now,
just by the meter itself was creating those reads. And for people who don't know, in Scientology auditing, you're holding on to the cans with an e-meter and the dial.
Electrodes,
yeah, there's a needle that's making certain movements. And when you train in Scientology, you're trained to decipher what these movements mean. Each movement means something while you're going through and doing auditing. Well, it's amazing to me how anybody gets through anything. I mean, and also why I had this feeling when I finished operating Thetan level 3, the Xenu level, it was a relief to not have to do it anymore. The win was that I was done and I wouldn't have to do it anymore. And I think about
I'd like to test.
Yes.
That was awful.
Yeah, to the upper levels, like operating thetan level 7, where you're auditing out body thetans that supposedly could be on the moon and 1,000 miles away from you. It's
Quantum entanglement.
yeah.
Yeah. So the e-meter, in about, I think it was 79 or 80, we got silver sealing. And we were told that our e-meters had to every year be serviced to make sure they were working properly, and we'd have to pay for it. What we weren't told was why this was happening. Now, the e-meter at that time, and probably the contemporary ones, I'm not really interested in taking one apart. But the e-meter's what's called the tone arm, which you're moving to keep the needle on the dial. The e-meter measures skin resistance, electrical resistance, and it actually, I am told by somebody who knows a lot more about this than I do, that your sweat glands in your hand, it's not about you sweating, which people often say, well, I didn't sweat. It wasn't that. It's not about producing sweat. It's that the sweat glands change, and the electrical resistance in your hands will change according to the sweat glands, whether there's any sweat produced or not. So you're measuring that electrical resistance, and it's important to know that you're measuring the electrical resistance in your hands with a current, small currents pass through your body. It's worth mentioning that the TENS machine, which is used for pain relief.
Yeah, I have one. I put it on my back.
Yeah, well, that's like an e-meter. It's passing a small charge through you. So it could be that people are responding to the e-meter positively because it's giving them this slight pain relief. One of the other things that's going on.
Even though you can't feel it, because when you're holding on to the electrodes, you don't feel anything.
No.
So the e-meter, which I've known for a while, I've known it was BS. I didn't understand why. And what's just flooding my brain right now is all of the decisions that people have made based on what happens in a Scientology session. It's basically all bullshit. I mean, it's all made up. Even it was our imagination then.
Yep.
Which is kind of what I was thinking, but I just wasn't sure. Oh my God.
Would you like to write a success story?
Wow. So the e-meter doesn't even work, which again, I knew that, but I didn't understand why.
Works to some extent. Sorry.
Yeah. That's so funny. Adam says Natalie has been auditing her back without knowing it.
You've probably got rid of loads of body thetans without having to pay, and free service, free fall. So you should have paid. The tone arm on a meter is a potentiometer, which is to say a dimmer switch. It's like a dimmer switch on a light. That's all it is, and it's a carbon potentiometer because it's made of carbon. And every time you move it, little specks of carbon are being released into the machine. Now, one of the things that interested me as a Scientologist, and I've spent plenty of time learning how to play with an e-meter in the auditing course I did, and in the solo auditing I did and all that kind of stuff. But it interested me that you could switch an e-meter on and not have plugged the electrodes in, and it would produce the read that is called a rock slam. So it's jagged, flitting about all over the screen, slapping about. And I saw it enough times with nothing plugged in. Now that means that when there is something plugged in, it can still do that.
Wow. And then that would mean like you have an evil intention, you're evil. If you have that rock slam phenomena, so multiple people were sent to the rehabilitation project force for having this phenomenon on the meter of this rock slam because it indicated you had evil intentions. Oh my effing God. None of it was real. I mean, I knew this, but I didn't understand what really happened. Like I've been out of Scientology for 15 years. I've known it's BS, but I didn't understand why.
Yeah. And you have to suffer from my personal aberration of systematizing and having to have answers to questions to just keep on going. So year in, year out. And I have done a lot of other things in the last 40 years. I've studied hundreds, literally, of groups, terrorist groups, gangs, pseudo-religions, pseudo-therapies, commercial cults, all sorts of things, and written a couple of novels along the way. But there is so much of it when you start looking, where did he get this from? What was he doing? With the rock slam, and because the rock slam was originally, Hubbard said, every Althea Hart in the Aboree said L. Ron Hubbard should date his revelations. It should be, this is it, 1953. This is it, 1954. Now, what of course he did in the end was all of the failed processes, none of them had worked. They'd all been put aside. Now I've found out how to do it now. No, I got it wrong that time. I've found out how to do it. You can see him writing this again and again, where in Science of Survival, he cancels the method from Dianetics. What he did in the 60s was he created the bridge, bring back all of the failed methods, package them together, and you've got something like a subprime mortgage. You give people all of these things. So with the rock slam, originally, and this is a misunderstood, and this may be why Scientology doesn't work, because people have a misunderstanding of what the word rock in rock slam means. Do you have any idea why it's called a rock slam? What the rock refers to?
No.
Not taught it.
Like rocking?
Yeah. The rock was Hubbard's, this is it, basic. He found this thing which he called the rock. And if you got rid of that, then you'd be done. Then he decided it wasn't that, but that was the E-meter response. So the name stayed on. It's like the word squirrel. Almost nobody in Scientology knows why the word squirrel is used.
Why?
It's a hamster wheel, a squirrel cage. Hubbard says the person will just keep going round and round and round and getting nowhere, so they're a squirrel.
Oh.
But you see, you're probably going to go back after this. We can have this session. You're going to clear up all your misunderstoods. You go, wow, I really want to be in Scientology now. I understand what it means. In 1970-71, Otto Roos, who was the top dog in Scientology at that time in Sealg, he was one of only 5 people trained on the Class 12 course, the highest course in Scientology. He was the only person to do OT8, the highest level, before 1988. And Hubbard got sick, as he used to do every winter, because he smoked 100 cigarettes a day.
Ah. Yeah.
Sorry, something flashed up on the screen there. Somebody wanted to know something?
No, just starring something.
Okay. So, he got sick, and that's how the clearing course came about, because he had bronchial pneumonia. The next year he got sick, and he's in Gran Canaria, and that's how he got OT3. So every winter he'd get bronchial pneumonia, and he'd deal with the problem, but he wouldn't stop smoking. 100 cigarettes a day. Talk about compulsive personality.
How many cigarettes are in a pack of cigarettes?
20.
So he smoked 5 packs of cigarettes a day.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, and he would complain to the messengers that he wished he could give up. And this is the founder of Narconon.
Yeah.
That's going to teach you how to get over drug addiction. He finally cut down to 80 a day, but he was smoking unfiltered. It's a brand called Picoons, which were made in New Orleans. He smoked Cools before that. So strong, unfiltered cigarettes, 100 a day. And so he got sick in the winter of 70, 71, I think it was.
Mm-hmm.
And I interviewed Otto at some length back in the 80s. And Otto got every scrap of paper that would constitute a record of Hubbard's auditing. He got it all together, just piles of this stuff. And he went through it. He said some things were written on envelopes. He went through it. He put it in order. And when he was done, now Hubbard had changed his mind about the rock slam. It no longer indicated that you'd found the thing that was really important to find, the rock. Mm-hmm. It now meant you had evil purposes.
Yeah.
So Otto pointed out that he'd found 200 rock slams in Ron Hubbard's folders. And the next thing he knew, he was standing on the dock with his passport. And he was no longer.
Oh, wow.
200 rock slams. So, yeah, does the E-meter work? If we get into the techniques themselves, look at, let's start with training routines. I did a video, I did a conference in Toronto in 2015, Getting Clear of Scientology. And it was meant to be my swan song. I went off and started the Open Minds Foundation. I was not going to be involved with Scientology anymore. And here I am. But, you know, I came back because I realized that people don't get over this. You know, and I think you cited Conway and Siegelman, it takes 12 and a half years to, in one of your videos. I was in touch with them. They wrote that in about 1990 in the book Snapping. And I was in touch with them in 2013 because I'd said something vaguely insulting about them. I'd suggest that they didn't understand Scientology because they'd only interviewed 3 people, and they pointed out they'd interviewed 33 people. But so I apologized and said, you know, your estimation was, firstly, Scientology has the most debilitating set of rituals of any cult in America, they wrote early on. But in Snapping, they wrote, where the Krishnas, the Moonies, 3 months, 6 months, it'll all have evaporated, it'll have gone. Scientology, we estimate 12 and a half years unaided. So I wrote to them and said, you've had time to think about this. It's like 23 years later.
Yeah.
I would say that unaided, the majority of people never recover. And they came back and said, yes, we think you're right.
Tell me this, what would be considered recovered from Scientology? Because when I heard that, I thought, well, I definitely at about the 12 and a half year mark, there was a big shift, I think, in me. But when I look back at that now, because I've thought to myself, because people have asked me, well, what happened 3 years ago? Well, my partner got diagnosed with cancer. So I think the shock, it shifted so much in terms of priorities. And I could not like deal with my Scientology crazy, as I called it. I just needed to, you know, I really needed to be able to focus and stuff. And so I just let go of a lot. It had as horrific as it was, it had an effect on me that was positive in terms of helping me move beyond Scientology. But I've always wondered, what does it mean to be recovered from Scientology? What would that look like?
Well, let me give you an example of a recovered Jehovah's Witness, because that's a very simple one. I've worked with a lot of them too. And if you say the word Armageddon to somebody who's been in the Jehovah's Witnesses and they go, whoa, then you know that they've not recovered.
Okay.
If you're talking about Scientology with somebody and expressing an opinion about it and they start to get angry, or they withdraw, you know, if they become emotional, or what Hubbard would call misemotional, then it suggests that they are still under the spell. The enchantment is still working. Everybody, you know, my friend Hoyt Richards worked on the wonderful documentary Seduced about Keith Raniere and NXIVM. Awful. And he told me that he'd taken the former members aside and said, it'll take you a long time to recover. And I kind of went, Hoyt, you can't ever predict that. There are some people who are resilient. There was one little study of post-traumatic stress disorder that said that about 16% of people never suffer from it. It doesn't matter what you do to them, they will not get the symptom set. That's not necessarily a good thing. That might be a terrible thing. You know, it might be that psychopaths are among the people that don't get this. They probably are. But it's this concept of resilience. There's a brilliant guy called George Bonanno who wrote a book called The End of Trauma, where he assesses post-traumatic stress disorder. And he's got a lot of work behind him. And he's saying it's really variable from one person to another. You know, there were Auschwitz victims who were assessed 25 years later, and it was found that most of them were not showing any signs of distress. Now, if you can get over that, you can. I know.
I was about to say. So the Moonies, the JWs, people who suffered in the Holocaust can recover from it, but we can't recover fully from Scientology.
Yeah.
And why?
Well, don't. It's not can't. It's don't. Because Aaron Hubbard, of course we can. And some people do spontaneously recover. That's down to what your experience was. I was, you know, it took me a long time after I'd left to realize that I was never abused or humiliated. and that everybody I was talking to, and I can't think of an exception, had in some way been abused and humiliated. They'd been diminished in some way. They'd been overwhelmed. They'd been controlled. They'd,
every day in the Sea Org was incredibly overwhelming. It just became that was what was normal, and you just had to find a way to live with it.
Yeah,
maybe that's what we do now. We just find a way to live with it.
Yeah, and you and I have both realised that the Sea Org is human trafficking. It's modern slavery, and if you are completely controlled, the condition called complex post-traumatic stress disorder, which is quite different from combat post-traumatic stress disorder. We've had this treatment recently, the stellate ganglion block. I am very hesitant about this treatment. There is no evidence that this treatment will work on complex post-traumatic stress disorder, because the etiology, the development of complex post-traumatic stress disorder is different. With combat PTSD, something has happened, something overwhelmingly awful has happened. The guy next to you has had his head blown off, and that, you're thrown into this terrible condition. With complex PTSD, what's happening is that you've been enslaved. Your control over yourself has been taken away, and which is the Sea Organization. Anybody who isn't David Miscavage, who's in the Sea Organization, is enslaved, and they are very likely to develop complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, the good news is that for most people, in fact, 95% of people, that aspect of it, they will overcome quite naturally and with time. About 5% of people who need help, and you can certainly speed the process up. I've worked with somewhere over 600. I don't really do it anymore, but over the years, I've worked with about 600 people coming out of Scientology. With some people, it's just an afternoon. And they
It's
go,
just a what? Just an afternoon, and they kind of like break free from that.
Yeah.
It's interesting because even though many of us who leave Scientology, like I don't operate off of any of the beliefs, and I've had an opportunity to look at them, especially the more destructive characteristics, of a lack of empathy, a lack of compassion, and inability. Forgiveness wasn't even a word in Scientology. So I've tried to, and as part of my healing, really lean into those heavier than Scientology, which would be threaten, punish, threaten, punish, threaten, punish, over and over and over again, just to get people to comply and do what you were trying to get them to do. And I know for me, in my experience, that was a huge turning point in what I felt my recovery from Scientology was in leaning into forgiveness, compassion, understanding, love, and not hate, which is very hard to do sometimes. But what I found was that when I could do that, it was completely separate from like my Scientology personality that I had developed to survive in Scientology. It goes against everything we learned and were in Scientology, especially the Sea Organization. And it hasn't failed me yet. Like I find, because I've had moments where something would happen and boom, that like Sea Org mentality will kick in. And I've had to like do some breathing exercises, take a step back, look at it, reframe it, use some cognitive behavioral therapy tools and go, okay, that's, what is another way of looking at this? What could I do? And it helped me strengthen those muscles around compassion and forgiveness that never existed growing up. It just wasn't a part. And it wasn't like, because I can remember not always just walking around with a bunch of hate in my heart. There was that too, but it was more complete and utter indifference. Just no feeling. I had no feeling about it because we were taught to compartmentalize our feelings and not feel and experience them. Such a disassociation from our emotions And it gave this false idea of it made us better somehow because we weren't subjected to misemotion, as it's called in Scientology, grief, anger, fear, all of those things. Do you think that, because part of what you said earlier, Scientology really creates people, it can create people, it encourages a lack of compassion, it encourages an attitude or feeling like you need to attack to control, and that you have to control all of these things in people. Whereas in reality, what I've come to learn afterwards is actually, no, I don't need to clear the planet. I don't need to save mankind. I just need to worry about me, and my family and my friends, like in my circle, where I actually have an influence and can make a difference. That was a huge part of the mind control for me, of letting go of that. This is all my responsibility, that I need to control people.
Yeah, absolutely. And you hit the the core problem, which is that if Scientology is a way of cloning Ron Hubbard, who was a narcissistic sociopath who didn't care at all, when he was given news of his son Quentin dying, he said, "Oh, more bad publicity."
Wow. And Quentin was the one who was 21?
Yeah, 21, 22, who killed himself because he was gay, and he was being prohibited from being gay. And the people I've interviewed a few people who knew him reasonably well. He sounds like a really lovely person, not an intellectual certainly, but a really gentle person. He just didn't fit in. And of course, Hubbard had named him his successor in the 60s. He said, Quentin will take over from me. I talked with a guy who had looked at all of the papers that the FBI seized in the largest raid in their history on Scientology. And he said that there were papers there because the FBI couldn't read Scientologies. They didn't know what they were looking at. So when there were orders to perform R245, routine 245, which Hubbard demonstrated. Yeah, he used a method of exteriorization frowned upon in our time, the book Creation of Human Ability. And in the lecture, which that's a record of, he actually had a Colt 45 and fired a shot through the floor to show what he meant. And then he would issue R245 orders. And of course, what on earth does that mean? Who cares? This guy said that he'd found among the material that the FBI had taken and did not understand that there had been an armed group within the Guardian's office. It was separate from Branch 1. It was called Branch 4. And they went to the owners of gay clubs where Quentin had been, and they would find the owner, put a gun in their mouth and say, "This is a picture of Quentin Hubbard. If we find out he's coming here again, this is what's going to happen."
Whoa.
So Quentin was alienated from the community he was trying to join. He was taught by his father, who, by the way, did have homosexual encounters himself as a young man. He wrote letters about it when he was 16.
L. Ron Hubbard did?
Yes.
L. Ron Hubbard did. Wow.
He also took LSD. He also, most of the things we were prohibited from, or anybody was prohibited from doing, he'd done. Because as he explained in the Philadelphia Doctorate course, in a game, you have the pieces and they mustn't know what the rules are. And you have the players and their job is to keep the rules from the pieces. And then you have the game maker and none of the rules apply to the game maker. He explains this. It's just you have to get what he's telling you. He's a game maker. He could make OTs, therefore he could make gods. So he was a god maker. Nobody else would ever, no matter how high up the bridge they got, be able to discover technology. Only Hubbard would ever have the intellect to do that. Well, there's a problem for me.
Yeah, that's true. That just leaves him as the one and only source there. What do you think in the research and things that you've done would help people who are former Scientologists to recover, to just get beyond that, especially Sea Org members, because it does seem to be where that is probably the worst concentration of mini Hubbards running around, because we were literally being raised and trained to be exactly like him and to be compliant and to just operate as this Borg almost. It was always
Yes.
about the group, never about the individual.
Mm.
Are there things that people have found today? Like, I know what's helped me, but is there more other things that, whether they're former Scientologists, former cult members of any kind, former Sea Org members, could do that would help their recovery? Because I think part of it too, Jon, is sometimes I think people, former Scientologists, sometimes some don't realize that they're still being Scientologists, that they're
No.
still operating off of the programming of attack, 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 and this overdeveloped sense of, I am the one, I decide how you should live. I
Mm.
decide how these people should live. And if
Mm.
they don't live within my moral code or how I see fit, I must punish them.
Mm.
That's very much completely right out of the Sea Org and Scientology.
Yeah, it's the essential implant of Scientology. I'm happy that you use the word Borg. I've called Scientology the B-org for a long time. It is making people have one mind. But the essential implant in Scientology is the only one. And Hubbard lectured on this subject. People who think they're the only one who understands. And one of the hallmarks of authoritarian cults, destructive cults, is the sense of superiority. So,
Yes.
I'm part of the elite, and
Yeah.
you're just a scumbag.
Well, that's the whole thing with the Sea Org. We come back. Our job is to get ethics in on the planet. Like, they're the ones who decide how people should live. And it's something that can sometimes, even when people leave, that programming doesn't separate out, that they're still operating in that way. What do you think helps that?
There are a lot of things that are helpful, and you touched on probably the most important one, which is compassion.
Mm-hmm.
That what am I doing? How am I behaving towards people? And is that right?
Mm-hmm.
So, firstly, you have this contradiction of that you've been taught not to look after yourself. You've been taught to be sleep
Yeah.
deprived. You've been taught malnourishment as a basic way of being.
Mm-hmm.
So the first basics: sleep. Find out when it's best for you to sleep. One of the perversities in our society is that while Nobel Prizes have been given, doctors, for the most part, don't understand that you're born with a fixed sleep pattern. And there's work by Matthew Walker, who's a professor at Berkeley and a professor of neuroscience. And he basically reckons that about 30% of people have what's called a delayed sleep-wake phase. Doctors will treat them for insomnia, but there are people who naturally, like me, which is why I know about this. I also like David Miscavage and Aaron Hubbard, as it happens, but I'm not claiming any other similarity to them. I normally sleep from about 4 in the morning until noon, and I am relatively sharp. My memory works. My immune system is very good. If you mess with that, as the Sea Org does, then people will have low-level infections functioning often. They'll feel exhausted. So finding out when you sleep, how much sleep you need, and getting that is the basis of recovery and health. Then making sure your diet is good, and that is the Mediterranean diet. We over here have Professor Tim Spector, who is absolutely brilliant. He's one of the 100 most cited scientists in the world now, who has worked out that, a diet that's low in animal fats and low in sugars is healthier.
Wow.
So moving away from the high carbohydrate diets, which are routine in authoritarian groups, white rice diets, the rice and beans diets, this
Rice and
kind of thing.
beans.
Yeah. And having lots of vegetables, particularly leafy vegetables, all of that stuff. So focusing on that, getting some exercise, and doing things you like doing. Often as people come out, they are determined to find out everything they possibly can, and they get too caught up in that. Find out things you like. If you like to go swimming or you want to go to the movies, in the Sea Org, that's all. You're being selfish. You know, you're not
Yeah.
serving all the other dynamics.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. And the only way that we have to nourish ourselves if we're going to be able to nourish others. So be gentle on yourself, be forgiving towards yourself. If you find that you are having hateful outbursts, and we have seen in the last year, you know, I joined the Aftermath Foundation and then went to Aaron and said, can we sort this out, you know, and talk with everybody I possibly could to say, we need, and you said this in a video just the other week, we need to focus on helping people escape, and we need to focus on helping people recover.
Mhm.
And a lot of what we're seeing, and it's justified, I understand the complaints that have gone around, but there's been so much heat and so little light generated, and such an absence of compassion, such
Mhm.
an absence of believing in redemption, saying, you know, people can get better, they can become something else.
Mhm.
So having that positive and compassionate attitude is important. The other thing, which I think is important, and I have looked the word up, so I know what it means. I'm not sure I've got any of it, but that's humility. That's being willing to step away from the Scientological perspective of I'm right
Yeah.
and go, sometimes I'm not right. Being
Mm.
able to apologize, and developing relationship. I was obsessed from the age of 17 with the concept of enlightenment. So I say I spent a year in Zen Buddhism and a few days in a monastery learning to meditate and all of that.
Mhm.
And all through Scientology, that was my intention. I thought there'd be a point where you have to step off the bridge to get this because somebody else can't give it to you. But that
Mhm.
it would help me to get there. It would teach me equanimity, because I got in Scientology because I'm an empath. And there are people who think that's a good idea. Believe me, it's a disability. That's all there is to it, that you have this knee-jerk reaction of wanting to help people. And it's not, you know, we should have rational compassion, as the professor at Yale has put it. So humility, having the capacity that it's okay to have been wrong. It's okay, say I misspoke. It's okay. You know, is it
Not such a strong drive of like it's kind of too like in the Sea Org, the drive in Scientology for perfection and expectation of perfection is huge. The way we're trained as Scientology auditors is all about perfection. It's doing something
bloodless,
perfectly. Yeah,
bloodless.
exactly. Completely relentless. And it really is something that is
Mm.
unobtainable and also not desirable, because why do we even need perfection? It's
And
the
what is it?
imperfections, yeah, that makes things so, I think, so much more interesting. It's so interesting though that what you're saying then basically it's coming out of Scientology and especially the Sea Org and leaning into basic human decency, learning how to do that, which is something that we were deprived of, especially if you grew up in the Sea Org. I grew up in
Yeah.
Scientology, but I grew up in a home with my parents, at least until I was 15. And then I went to, Los Angeles for
Mm.
training, and then I joined the Sea Org. That doesn't make a lot of sense because I found that that's been helpful. I just feel like I rather make the mistake of being overly compassionate than being
Yeah.
harsh, because especially in this in a world, in a community where there are former members of a cult that is, as you said, and we've heard from other experts, is incredibly difficult to recover from that. But to recover from it, you have to let go of all of those ideas that, you are the center of the universe in terms of what you think and feel. And this is something not even limited to Scientology. I've met people who were never in Scientology who still felt very entitled about how other people live, be what,
Mm.
who they hang out with, who they marry, whatever
Oh,
it is.
yeah. Yeah.
It's just fascinating to me. I have to grab a couple of these questions because I've been completely monopolizing you and not letting the chat in here.
Well, let me just say a couple of things quickly. One is understand who Ron Hubbard was. My
Mhm.
Blue Sky was the basis for Russell Miller's book. He had my manuscript before he wrote Barefaced Messiah. Those two books cover Hubbard and who he was. That releases a lot of tension when you realize that you know, he didn't have a good motivation. Understand the history of Scientology and the amount of damage that it's done to people. This is not a way of liberating people. But the third part, and this is the part that many cult experts don't get to, and it baffles me, is what do you still believe? Go back and read Fundamentals of Thought or Problems of Work. Look at what he's saying and see if it's true. I'll give you the example I always give, which is the ARC triangle. What Ron Hubbard says is, if you increase communication, you will always increase affinity, reality, whatever that is, and understanding. Always, always, always. This is a fact, a scientific fact of life. All right. So if I shout at somebody, which is communication, does that increase their affinity? Does that increase their understanding? Hubbard also said bullets too are communication. So if I shoot somebody, they should like me more if this is true. Another one is the 8 dynamics. This blew my mind. I got together a room of 12 people with more than 200 years experience in Scientology. This was many years ago. And I said, I've got this idea. We're going to go around the room from my left, not starting with me, starting on the left, coming to me last, so that I'm not the authority in the room. And everybody tell me, when you applied the 8 dynamics to solve a problem, nobody in the room had ever, more than 200 years experience of Scientology between the 12, 13 of us, nobody had ever done it. So I then said, well, look, let's look at this method of problem solving. You get 1 vote. Mankind, 8 billion people, get 1 vote. Hang on, there's something wrong here. God, if you believe in God, 7 votes. The other 7 dynamics are out, and sorry, God. I'm afraid this is just, it's pseudoscience. There's nothing scientific in this idea. So, but go back and, you know, the thing that people often don't do is re-examine, and there may well be things that you still agree with. And that's fine too.
Yeah, there are some.
To your decision about it, not mine, not anybody else.
Yeah. Oh, that makes a lot of sense. Let's see. I'm going to go backwards here. Carla's loving wife. Jon, what is one thing that L. Ron Hubbard about LRH that most Scientologists don't know about and would be shocked?
I asked this question of a Hubbard aide who seemed to be getting upset with what I was saying, former aide. I said, well, what was the thing you best remember about Ron Hubbard? And he said, the lump on his head. I went, I'm sorry. He said, yeah, he had a massive sebaceous cyst, like a baseball on his forehead. Yeah. When you look at the Sea Org pictures, he has his cap pulled down. Maud Castillo took most of those pictures. The cap's always pulled down over the huge sebaceous cyst. So this is an acne spot. That's all it is. But he didn't dare go to a doctor for. So, and there are pictures of him in Queens, New York in the beginning of 1973 that were taken by Jim Dinkelsey. And there's one of them in my book. And you can see it, this enormous lump. And you're going, so you are the greatest being in the universe, and you daren't even go to the doctor to have a spot treated.
Yeah, that says a lot. Sabine's asking, why is it that some ex-Scientologists pull rank on each other?
I think that pecking order is really important in Scientology, and the idea that you're a superior being and, you know, more knowing than others. That delusion, which is the delusion of all sociopathic narcissists, that I'm the best, you know, and
I know better. I'm the authority.
I'm the only one.
Authority. I'm the only one.
I'm the only one.
I'm the only one that can make this happen. Potstir 420, is Scientology an intelligence operation? It would explain why the government seems to not care about the abuse.
Which is the question, is Scientology being directed by an intelligence agency? And there is some evidence to suggest that Ron Hubbard was an asset, that intelligence agencies may have been using him. There is no evidence that he was an agent. There is a very peculiar statement, and it's baffled me for years. In Science of Survival in 1951, Hubbard talks about the use of pain drug hypnosis by intelligence agencies in the US. And nobody talked about this again for more than 20 years when MK Ultra, which hadn't quite started, but Operation Bluebird, the first US mind control operation, was underway. And he probably knew about it from Robert Heinlein, because Robert Heinlein is one of the people he had sex with. They were very close.
L. Ron Hubbard?
Yeah. Heinlein records in his diaries that he offered his wife to Hubbard, and Hubbard had sex with her, and then he had sex with him.
And who is he again?
Robert Heinlein was the author of Stranger in a Strange Land and many other very successful science fiction books. He's, along with Asimov, they're considered the greats of the golden age of science fiction.
Wow. Itchy Thetans, did Hubbard make homosexuality taboo in the cult out of spite toward Quentin?
No, it was made taboo right from the start because he saw that it was something that was unpopular in the society. You know, and bear in mind that until the 1990s, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association listed homosexuality as a mental disorder. So he was part of, I'm afraid, that culture, the anti-gay culture.
Sign of the times. Irina says, I talked with former U.S. military people. For the first few years after leaving, they are always on guard and super alert. I was like that when I left the Sea Org. That is something that within my family, two of us were in the Sea Org. My daughter spent a lot of time, my oldest, at Flag. That is still something that, you know, I feel like I would like to get further in my healing from that. It's just I have to identify all sounds. Like, what is that sound? Where is it coming from? What's happening here? Just which I recognize is still part of like the CPTSD kind of a thing.
Exactly.
I took a toy of my grandson's the other day. You push it down, you put it down, and it pops up, kind of like a Jack in the Box. And I was standing there and I thought, so I put it down, and I watched it, and it popped up and I went, whoosh. And I thought, that's odd. I put it down, I pushed it down, and I watched it. I knew it was going to happen. And I thought, well, I'm not going to react because I know it's going to happen. And it popped and I went,
Yeah.
It took days. And now, and like literally I tried, because I left it on the kitchen counter, and I got to the point where I could physically not show a reaction, but inside I was completely reacting just as bad as the very first time. I just was able to physically not, no one could tell if they were looking at me.
Yeah, which of course is something we learn in Scientology. We learn to be deadpan. We learn not to show our feelings, not to react. It is an aspect of PTSD, complex or otherwise, the startle response, hypersensitivity.
So many people in my family, it's the same thing. My sister, our grandkids even are like, they know, do not scare grandma. Don't come up and startle grandma. Don't, boo, nothing like that. And the little kids, they know this about a couple of us, and they've been really good about not doing it. Like the family knows we are not the people you want to sneak up on, because you might, you just never know.
And as you say, breathing exercises, and let me put a caution in, I am not a fan of mindfulness. I don't think it's a good idea. There are people who've had awful reactions trying to meditate because, they weren't prepared for it. So not meditation as such, but breathing deeply and slowly. I think in any situation, that's a really good thing, because you'll start to hyperventilate, you'll start to breathe too fast, you get too much oxygen in your blood, and you'll feel really awful. So withdrawing from the thing that's upset you, breathing deeply, and finding the things that relax you and delight you, walking in the woods or listening to Indian classical music, or find things that you enjoy, and gradually those responses will diminish. And also be aware of the people around you, that there are times, if you're feeling delicate, surround yourself with supportive people.
Yes.
Don't engage with discouraging people.
Yeah, no, I found that very much to be true. in my delicate state.
In your delicate state.
I've been in a delicate state for a while, and
Yeah.
I've definitely found that I have to protect myself that way of like, "Hey, I can't get into your whatever this is because I need to protect me because it's taking, the energy I have just to do the things I need to do each day." Um,
I mean, my situation was different from most in that I had 9 years in Scientology, no abuse, no humiliation. I was fine when I walked away. Then they harassed me for 16 years. And really, it took me another 17 years after that to get back. So I do understand, even though I was, I went and saw somebody and I did not have symptoms of PTSD. But if the stress is real now, it's not, post-traumatic, it's actual trauma. And, finding yourself involved in 10 court cases at the same time was pretty scary.
Yeah, that would be traumatic.
I didn't enjoy it.
Robert says, I've been out for over 35 years and I'm still affected. Honestly, I don't know.
You're saying, am I still affected? Well, that's for you. That's
Oh,
for you.
am I still affected?
Yeah, that's for you to decide. One of Hubbard's tricks, and it's a trick used by many people, is to say you have a hidden enemy inside, you don't know about it. And if you did know about it, you wouldn't have it. Psychologists and therapists do this as well. They tell you have an unconscious mind and it's making decisions for you. You don't. You have unconscious processes, but there isn't a little devil in there that's fighting against you. So I'm not up for Jungian anima, shadow theory, or any of this nonsense, demon possession, any of it. You decide how well you're doing, and it's not up to anybody else. And sometimes, I mean, Cyril Vosper, who a good friend of mine, he wrote The Mind Benders about Scientology, having been in for 14 years. He left in 1968. And when I was first in touch with him, he said, it still happens. By then he'd been out for 14 years, 15 years. He said, I'm crossing the street and I'll suddenly go, did I commit an overt? This Scientology word would pop into his mind. And I think it's just whenever something like that comes up, you think about it. If you use a Scientology expression, it's very good to dig the language out. I call Scientologists devotees. That's my contribution to that. You're sitting there going, dev OT. He's making a joke about devotees and dev T, and he's putting the two things together. And he's saying they are developed unnecessary operating thetans. And so, yeah, it's not about expelling the ideas of Scientology. It's about digesting them. It's about saying, oh yeah, this happened to me. And all too often we're focused on what happened to us and how rotten it was and how bad it makes us feel, or what we did and how bad it makes us feel that we did that, rather than looking at what made us do that, what techniques were applied. I was going to say at Toronto, and this is on my channel, I had Steve Hassan, Chris Shelton, it's the first time I met him, and the amazing Christian Sturko, who's a very close friend of mine, brilliant counselor. And we demonstrated TRs and book one auditing and took them apart to show how. Steve has said that training routine 0 is the most overt use of hypnotism he has ever seen in a cult group. And he's been working at this long with me. Yeah, it's a way of getting you to tune out. What's significant in that is the reason that the Chinese brainwashing program and the CIA's MK Ultra didn't work is because when you take somebody out of the environment that they've been conditioned in, it stops working. It gradually fades away. Scientology is self-reinforcing. That was Hubbard's brilliant addition, that you will keep yourself in the context of Scientology.
That makes so much sense. Okay, we're going to have to do this again. And I'm glad that you're a night owl because you're hours ahead and the timing will work out right. I have to do a members only live in 7 minutes. So we're just going to have to do it again. So when we'll set up another time. So I want to let everybody know we didn't get to all of the questions, but we are going to do this again. And we will grab more questions and stuff then. Thank you so much. It was so enlightening for me. And like I said, I feel I feel a little selfish because there's like well over we're 70 questions, and I'm like, wait, but I want to know this, I want to know that.
Well, you can either forward the questions to me and I'll do something on my channel about them, or we can do those questions and we really only got to the start of how this stuff works. There's so much to be said about it.
Oh my
But
gosh, I know.
let's do something soon. This has been such fun.
Absolutely. No, well, we'll figure out a date as soon as we log off here.
Mm.
Everybody's here. If you would be so kind as to hit that like button and hit that subscribe as well. If you're a member, we're doing a members only live in about 6 minutes or so. Catch it on the replay if you got to run. Jon Atack, thank you so much. I need to pull up because I didn't do this. Here is his website. You can find him, jonatack.co.uk. And from his website, you can find his social media, his YouTube channel. And if you'd like to check out his book, hold on, you can find it on Amazon, the main one we were talking about, which is Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky. That is on Amazon. You can find it there. We should all like book club it. That would be fun. But Jon,
Great.
Thank you so much. Hold on, because I'm going to talk to you backstage. Everybody else, thank you for being here. Please share this video. I know that I'm sending it to everybody in my family because I just feel like I got a lot out of it as a former member.
Right.
Yeah, so thank you. Thank you, everybody else. I hope y'all get out and have a fun cult-free evening.
Enjoy.